Maybe you're like me and so many other Americans who have studied history, read about events that have taken place on American soil, and you have never heard about the Rosewood Massacre that took place over 100 years ago. And all that is left is just a sign. But listen, I want to take this time and talk to you about a dark event that took place in our nation's history. Recently, I decided to take a trip to an unknown place that sits silently in America's history. After traveling through rural country highways and down Highway 24, I came upon the once thriving settlement, Rosewood, Florida. What is now known as the Rosewood Massacre was a racially motivated massacre of black people and the destruction of a black town that took place 100 years ago during the first week of January 1923 in rural Levy County, Florida. At least 6 black people and 2 white people were killed, but eyewitnesses' accounts suggested a higher death toll of 27 to 150 lives were taken. Before the massacre, the town of Rosewood had been a quiet, primarily black, prospering, and self-sufficient whistle stop on the Seaboard Airline Railway. Rosewood was settled in 1847, 9 miles east of Cedar Key, near the Gulf of Mexico. Most of the local economy drew on the timber industry. The name Rosewood refers to the reddish color of cut cedar wood. Local residents worked in several turpentine mills and a sawmill 3 miles away in Sumner, in addition to farming of citrus and cotton. Initially, Rosewood had both black and white settlers. When most of the cedar trees in the area had been cut by 1890, the pencil mills closed and many white residents moved to Sumner. By 1900, the population in Rosewood had become predominantly black. The village of Sumner was predominantly white, and relations between the two communities were relatively cordial. 2 black families in Rosewood, named Goins and Carrier, were the most powerful families. The Goins family brought the turpentine industry to the area, and in the years preceding the attacks were the second largest landowners in Levy County. To avoid lawsuits from white competitors, the Goins brothers moved to Gainesville, and the population of Rosewood decreased slightly. The Carriers were also a large family, primarily working at logging in the region. The population of Rosewood peaked in 1915 at approximately 355 people. By 1920, the residents of Rosewood were mostly self-sufficient. They had 3 churches, a school, a turpentine mill, a sugarcane mill, a baseball team named the Rosewood Stars, and 2 general stores. Some families owned pianos, organs, and other symbols of middle-class prosperity. The influx of black people into urban centers in the Northeast and Midwest increased racial tensions in those cities. Between 1917 and 1923, racial disturbances erupted in numerous cities throughout the U.S., motivated by economic competition between different racial groups for industrial jobs. In the mid-1920s, the Ku Klux Klan reached its peak membership in the South and Midwest after revival beginning around 1915. Its growth was due in part to tensions from rapid industrialization and social change in many growing cities. Trouble began in Rosewood when white men from several nearby towns lynched a black Rosewood resident because of accusations that a white woman in nearby Sumner had been assaulted by a black drifter. After eyewitnesses were interviewed, the facts were that the victim was actually raped by a white man. A mob of several hundred whites combed the countryside hunting for black people and burned almost every structure in Rosewood. Many black residents fled for safety into the nearby swamps, some clothed only in their pajamas. The survivors recalled that it was uncharacteristically cold for Florida at the time, and people suffered when they spent several nights in wooded areas called hammocks to evade the mob. On January 6, an ally, train conductors John and William Bryce managed to evacuate many black residents to Gainesville. The brothers were independently wealthy Cedar Key residents who had an affinity for trains. They knew the people in Rosewood and had traded with them regularly. As they passed the area, the Bryces slowed their train and blew the horn, picking up survivors. Many survivors boarded the train after having been hidden by white general store owner John Wright and his wife, Mary Jo. Several other residents of Sumner hid black residents of Rosewood and smuggled them out of town. Gainesville's black community took in many of Rosewood's evacuees, waiting for them at the train station and greeting survivors as they disembarked. On Sunday, January the 7th, a mob of 100 to 150 whites returned to burn the remaining dozen or so structures of Rosewood. No arrests were made for what happened in Rosewood. The town was abandoned. None of them ever moved back. None of them were ever compensated for the loss of their land, and the town ceased to exist. In February 1923, Governor Kerry Hardy appointed a special grand jury and special prosecuting attorney to investigate the outbreak in Rosewood and other incidents in Levy County. In February 1923, the all-white grand jury convened in Brunson. Over several days, they heard 25 witnesses, 8 of whom were black, but found insufficient evidence to prosecute any perpetrators. Despite nationwide news coverage in both white and black newspapers, the incident in the small abandoned village slipped into oblivion. Most of the survivors scattered around Florida cities and started over with nothing. Although the rioting was widely reported around the United States at the time, few official records documented the event. The survivors and their descendants and the perpetrators all remained silent about Rosewood for decades. 60 years after the rioting, the story of Rosewood was revived by major media outlets when several journalists covered it in the early 1980s, including writers from the Gainesville Sun and history professors at the University of Florida. The survivors and their descendants all organized in an attempt to sue the state for failing to protect Rosewood's black community. As a result of the findings, Florida compensated the survivors and their descendants for the damages which they had incurred because of the racial violence. The incident was the subject of a 1997 feature film which was directed by John Singleton. The state of Florida declared Rosewood a Florida Heritage Landmark in 2004 and erected a historical marker on State Road 24 that names the victims and describes the community's destruction. Scattered structures remain within the community, including a church, a business, and a few homes, notably John Wright's. Mary Hall Daniels, the last known survivor of the massacre at the time of her death, died at the age of 98 in Jacksonville, Florida on May 2, 2018. The legacy of Rosewood remained in Levy County. For decades, no black residents lived in Cedar Key or Sumner. The Real Rosewood Foundation is raising funds to move John Wright's house to nearby Archer, Florida, and make it a museum. The state of Florida in 2020 established a Rosewood Family Scholarship Program, paying up to $6,100 each to up to 50 students each year who are direct descendants of Rosewood families.
And so listen, I want to encourage you. Let's learn from our past, because as it goes, if we don't learn from our past, we are destined to repeat it in our future.